I reject the Alpha King. The words echoed across the moon hall with such impossible certainty that even the crackling torches seemed to fall silent. Hundreds of wolves stood frozen beneath towering stone arches as Evelyn Carter lowered her hand from the royal crest she had just refused to touch. Every tradition, every law, every whispered expectation insisted she should have accepted the bond the moment the moon goddess revealed it. Instead, she stepped back. Exactly 3 steps. Far enough to leave no room for misunderstanding. Across the polished marble floor, Alpha King Adrian Blackwood never raised his voice. He simply watched her with those steady silver eyes that had unsettled entire kingdoms. His expression remained calm, but everyone present felt the invisible pressure rolling through the hall, as if the very air had remembered who ruled it. No one spoke. No one breathed too loudly. Somewhere near the back, a ceremonial goblet slipped from trembling fingers and clattered across the floor before spinning to a stop. Evelyn never looked away. She had rehearsed this moment in her mind for 3 years, ever since fate had first decided something she had never agreed to. Your Majesty, the High Elder whispered carefully, perhaps the Lady Omega needs a moment. Evelyn answered before Adrian could. I've already had 3 years. A ripple of stunned whispers spread through the gathered packs. No Omega had ever rejected an Alpha King. Certainly not in front of nobles from every territory. Certainly not with a voice so steady that it sounded almost peaceful. Adrian inhaled slowly. Then tell me one thing, he said. Is there anything I can do that would change your answer? She held his gaze for 1 heartbeat longer before shaking her head. Not today. The silence that followed felt heavier than any argument. Adrian inclined his head with quiet dignity, accepting her answer without protest, but the moment he turned to leave, something unexpected happened. A deep, resonant growl rolled through the chamber. It did not come from Adrian's lips. It came from somewhere older, deeper, impossible to ignore. Every wolf instinctively stiffened. The Alpha King's wolf was awake. Adrian closed his eyes for only a second, as though silently asking for patience. The growl faded, replaced by an almost mournful rumble that echoed through the marble corridors before disappearing into the night. Confused murmurs filled the room. Evelyn remained perfectly still, yet she felt it too. Not fear. Not anger. Something stranger. Something persistent. As Adrian reached the great doors, he paused without turning around. I apologize, he said quietly. He disagrees with me. Evelyn frowned despite herself. Who? Adrian released the faintest breath that almost resembled a reluctant smile. My wolf. Before anyone could ask another question, the great doors opened, and the Alpha King disappeared into the moonlit courtyard. The ceremony ended in stunned silence, but the story did not. Because before dawn, royal guards would report something no one believed possible. The Alpha King had accepted her rejection. His wolf had not. By sunrise, the entire Northern Territories had heard the impossible story, yet every version sounded different. Some claimed the Alpha King had smiled after being refused. Others insisted the moon goddess herself had hidden the mating mark out of disappointment. The truth was stranger than every rumor. Adrian Blackwood spent the first hours of dawn alone inside the Western Tower, reading reports that never held his attention for more than a few seconds. Every time he reached the bottom of a page, his thoughts wandered back to the woman who had looked directly into his eyes without fear and quietly walked away. He could accept her decision. His wolf could not. The restless presence inside him paced like a storm trapped behind closed doors. It was not angry. It was determined. Adrian closed another report and leaned against the tall window overlooking the endless pine forest stretching toward the horizon. Usually the bond between king and wolf felt seamless, 2 minds moving with one purpose. Today it felt like arguing with the oldest friend he had ever known. You heard her answer, Adrian thought silently. She chose her own path. The answer came not in words but in instinct, warm and unwavering. Not yet. Adrian sighed. He had learned long ago that wolves rarely surrendered once they believed they had found their true mate. Still, he had expected disappointment, not stubborn optimism. A quiet knock interrupted his thoughts. His longtime advisor, Benjamin Hayes, entered carrying a stack of sealed letters. Your Majesty, Benjamin said carefully, the nobles are requesting guidance. They are uncertain how to explain yesterday's ceremony to their packs. Adrian accepted the letters without opening them. Tell them the truth. Benjamin blinked. Which truth? Adrian almost laughed. That Lady Evelyn exercised her right to choose. Benjamin hesitated. That answer will surprise many people. Then perhaps it is time they are surprised. Benjamin nodded respectfully before placing one final envelope on the desk. It carried no royal seal, only a small silver feather pressed into dark blue wax. Adrian frowned. Who sent this? No one knows. It appeared outside the palace gate before dawn. Adrian broke the seal and unfolded the single sheet inside. There were only 9 words written in elegant handwriting. Your wolf visited my garden before sunrise. Please stop apologizing. Adrian stared at the page. He had never left the palace. Neither had his guards reported any unusual movement. Benjamin watched his expression change. Is something wrong? Adrian slowly folded the letter again. Apparently my wolf has become more independent than either of us realized. At that exact moment, miles away, Evelyn stood outside the small cottage she had inherited from her grandmother. Fresh paw prints covered the dew-covered grass surrounding her flower beds. They were enormous, perfectly spaced, and impossible to mistake for any ordinary wolf. Beside the front steps rested a small bundle of wild lavender tied neatly with braided grass. No note, no scent of danger, only quiet persistence. Evelyn looked toward the distant mountains where the royal palace disappeared beneath morning clouds. She should have been annoyed. Instead, she found herself shaking her head with the smallest reluctant smile. You are making this much harder, she whispered to the empty yard. Somewhere beyond the tree line hidden by whispering pines, a large gray wolf quietly wagged his tail before disappearing into the forest without ever letting her see him. The first week passed quietly, at least on the surface. The palace returned to its endless meetings, royal petitions, and border reports, while Evelyn settled back into the peaceful rhythm of tending her grandmother's cottage on the edge of Silver Pine Valley. She gathered herbs each morning, repaired old fences that winter storms had weakened, and convinced herself that the strange chapter of her life had finally closed. It should have been simple. She had made her choice. The Alpha King had respected it. Yet every sunrise revealed another small mystery that refused to disappear. Fresh paw prints circled the property before fading into the forest. Wildflowers she had never planted appeared beside the garden path. Once, after an evening thunderstorm, she found the broken gate already standing perfectly upright before she even stepped outside. No neighbor admitted helping. No traveler claimed responsibility. The forest itself seemed determined to keep its secret. Hundreds of miles away, Adrian Blackwood found himself living with an equally confusing reality. Every evening his wolf grew restless, pacing through his thoughts with quiet certainty until Adrian finally walked onto the highest balcony overlooking the moonlit kingdom. The feeling always pointed in the same direction. South. Toward Silver Pine Valley. Toward Evelyn. One night he finally spoke aloud despite being completely alone. You understand she deserves peace. His wolf answered with calm confidence rather than stubbornness. Peace does not mean loneliness. Adrian rubbed a hand across his face. You are impossible. The silent reply felt almost amused. You already knew that. Benjamin noticed the growing exhaustion in the king long before anyone else. During a council meeting, Adrian paused in the middle of discussing trade routes, distracted by a strange warmth passing through the bond. Benjamin quietly dismissed the other advisors before closing the chamber doors. Your Majesty, he asked gently, is your wolf still wandering? Adrian gave a resigned nod. Apparently he believes palace rules apply only to me. Benjamin smiled despite himself. Perhaps he is trying to tell you something. Adrian looked toward the distant mountains beyond the palace windows. He believes destiny can be negotiated. Benjamin laughed softly. Can it? Adrian considered the question longer than expected. I honestly do not know anymore. At nearly that same moment, Evelyn was returning from the village market carrying a basket filled with fresh bread, apples, and jars of homemade jam. Children playing near the town square suddenly waved excitedly toward the nearby woods. The big gray dog came back, one little boy announced with a grin. He helped Mrs. Parker find her lost sheep. Another child eagerly added, "He sat outside your cottage all morning until the rain stopped." Evelyn froze. Did anyone try to follow him? Every child shook their head. "He disappears whenever someone gets close," the smallest girl whispered. Evelyn thanked them before continuing home, but her thoughts refused to settle. As twilight painted the forest in shades of silver and blue, she stepped onto her porch with a warm cup of tea. The evening breeze carried the scent of pine and distant rain. Then she heard it. Not a growl, not a howl. Just one soft, patient exhale from somewhere beyond the trees, followed by complete silence. Evelyn looked toward the dark forest and folded her arms. "You know," she said with a reluctant smile that surprised even herself, "if this is your version of filing another appeal, it is becoming incredibly creative." Hidden among the pines, unseen golden eyes closed with quiet satisfaction before disappearing once more into the endless moonlit woods. By the end of the second week, Evelyn had stopped asking whether the mysterious visitor would return. The better question had become when. Every morning revealed another quiet act of kindness that no one could explain. Firewood appeared neatly stacked before cold evenings. Fallen branches vanished from the narrow trail leading to her cottage. Once, after a strong wind scattered dozens of clay flower pots across her yard, she stepped outside at sunrise to find every single one standing exactly where it belonged, each filled with fresh soil as though careful hands had worked through the night. The neighbors smiled knowingly whenever she mentioned it, but none claimed responsibility. They simply exchanged amused glances and changed the subject. Even the oldest villagers admitted they had never seen a wolf behave with such remarkable patience. Meanwhile, life inside the royal palace grew steadily more complicated. Adrian Blackwood had begun waking before dawn, not because of royal duties, but because his wolf insisted on wandering beyond the palace walls every single night. The royal guards faithfully reported that their king had never left his chambers, yet muddy paw prints somehow appeared beneath the eastern balcony every morning. Adrian eventually stopped questioning how it was possible. Instead, he focused on preventing panic among the court. During one council meeting, Lord Nathaniel Brooks cautiously cleared his throat before speaking. "Your Majesty, several ambassadors have expressed concern about the unusually large gray wolf wandering near Silver Pine Valley." Adrian calmly signed another document without looking up. "Has the wolf harmed anyone?" "No." "Has he frightened anyone?" Nathaniel hesitated. Apparently, he escorted an elderly traveler through the forest after sunset and then disappeared. Adrian placed the quill on the desk and looked toward Benjamin Hayes, who was already trying not to smile. "Then I believe our kingdom has one less problem than we thought." Benjamin waited until the meeting ended before quietly approaching the throne. "You realize the stories are spreading much faster now." Adrian nodded. "I know. People are calling him the king's ambassador." Adrian let out a soft laugh despite himself. He appointed himself to that position. Several days later, Evelyn traveled into town for the annual harvest market. The streets overflowed with music, handmade crafts, warm apple cider, and families celebrating beneath strings of glowing lanterns. She welcomed the distraction, hoping a busy afternoon might finally silence the constant thoughts circling in her mind. Instead, the opposite happened, as she admired a small stand filled with hand-carved wooden birds. A frightened puppy slipped away from its owner and darted toward the crowded road. Before anyone could react, a familiar gray shape emerged from between two rows of maple trees. The enormous wolf gently stepped in front of the tiny puppy, calmly guiding it back toward the child without a single threatening movement. The entire marketplace fell silent. Parents instinctively gathered their children closer, yet no fear followed. The wolf simply lowered his head, waited until the little girl hugged her puppy, and then turned toward the forest. Just before disappearing into the trees, he glanced once toward Evelyn. Their eyes met for only a heartbeat. There was no demand, no expectation, only quiet hope wrapped inside impossible patience. Evelyn felt something inside her heart shift ever so slightly. It was not surrender. It was not acceptance. It was simply the first small crack in a wall she had spent years carefully building. Far away inside the palace, Adrian suddenly looked up from a royal map as warmth rushed through the bond between himself and his wolf. He smiled without realizing it. "You saw her again," he whispered. Deep within his heart, The answer arrived with gentle certainty. Not yet. But she finally saw me. Autumn settled gently over Silver Pine Valley, painting the hills in shades of gold and crimson, yet nothing changed the strange routine that had quietly become part of Evelyn Carter's life. Every few days another thoughtful surprise appeared outside her cottage. A basket of perfectly ripe apples rested beside her porch after she mentioned to a neighbor that this year's harvest had been disappointing. A missing scarf she had searched for all afternoon somehow hung neatly over the garden fence the following morning. Even the birds seemed unusually comfortable, often gathering near the tree line where the enormous gray wolf patiently watched the forest without disturbing a single creature. The villagers slowly stopped treating his visits as something unusual. Instead, they began leaving small bowls of fresh water near the edge of the woods, smiling whenever they discovered the bowls carefully emptied before sunrise. Evelyn found herself caught between quiet gratitude and growing frustration. Every thoughtful gesture made it harder to remember why she had promised herself never to open her heart to anyone connected to the royal throne. One cool afternoon she finally decided enough was enough. Standing at the edge of the forest, she folded her arms and looked toward the towering pines. "I know you are out there," she called softly. The woods remained silent for several long seconds before a familiar gray figure slowly stepped into the afternoon sunlight. His thick silver-gray coat shimmered beneath the falling leaves, and his golden eyes rested on her with calm patience. He did not move closer. He simply waited. Evelyn released a slow breath. "You cannot solve every problem in my life." The wolf tilted his head slightly as though considering her words. "And you definitely cannot keep leaving gifts outside my house forever." The enormous wolf sat down politely. Evelyn almost laughed despite herself. "Do not look at me like that. It makes this conversation impossible." At that exact moment, far away inside the royal palace, Adrian suddenly paused during a meeting with foreign ambassadors. Benjamin Hayes noticed the distant look crossing the king's face. "Is he visiting her again?" Adrian nodded almost apologetically. "Apparently they are having a conversation." Benjamin blinked in surprise. "Can you actually tell?" Adrian smiled with quiet resignation. "Not every word. Only the feeling." Benjamin leaned back thoughtfully. "And how is it going?" Adrian closed his eyes for one brief moment before answering. "Better than I deserve." Back in the forest, Evelyn slowly stepped forward until only a few feet separated them. The wolf never moved. She carefully studied the intelligent eyes watching her without pressure or expectation. "You really are just as stubborn as he is," she whispered. The wolf responded by gently placing one oversized paw on the ground between them, almost like offering a peaceful handshake instead of demanding trust. Evelyn stared at the gesture before shaking her head with an amused smile she could no longer hide. That definitely came from him. For the first time since everything had begun, she reached out carefully and rested her fingertips against the thick fur along the wolf's neck. Warm, soft, real. The wolf closed his eyes for only a heartbeat, perfectly content with that single moment before quietly standing again. He turned toward the deeper forest, looked back at Evelyn one last time, and calmly disappeared between the ancient pines. That evening Adrian sat alone beneath the palace balcony as moonlight spread across the kingdom. A quiet warmth settled over the bond, carrying something completely new. Not victory, not acceptance, simply hope. For the very first time, his wolf was no longer filing appeals alone. Evelyn had finally answered one with kindness. The first snow of the season arrived earlier than anyone expected, covering Silver Pine Valley beneath a quiet blanket of white that softened every rooftop, every winding trail, and every ancient pine. Evelyn Carter stood outside her cottage before sunrise, wrapping a warm wool shawl around her shoulders as she watched delicate flakes drift through the pale morning light. Winter had always reminded her of endings, yet this year it felt strangely different. Somewhere beyond the silent forest, she knew a familiar gray wolf was probably watching to make sure she was safe, and for reasons she could not fully explain, that thought no longer unsettled her. It comforted her. The realization frightened her more than anything else. She returned inside and carefully opened an old cedar chest that had belonged to her grandmother. Beneath neatly folded quilts rested a bundle of yellowed letters tied together with a faded blue ribbon. She had avoided reading them for years, convinced that some memories were kinder when left untouched. Today her hands moved almost on their own. The first letter was written in her grandmother's elegant handwriting. It spoke of hope, forgiveness, and choices that every generation must make for itself. The second mentioned the royal family only once, but that single sentence made Evelyn stop breathing for a moment. Your heart must never judge a son for the burdens carried by his father. She quietly closed the letter, unable to continue. Those words reopened memories she had buried long ago. She remembered frightened whispers after her parents disappeared during a political conflict between rival houses. She remembered neighbors blaming the old royal court for every unanswered question. Most of all, she remembered promising herself that she would never trust anyone wearing a crown. The promise had protected her for years. Now it felt heavier than ever. At the palace, Adrian Blackwood was facing a different kind of burden. An elderly royal archivist named Margaret Collins entered his study carrying several leather-bound records that had not been opened in decades. "Your Majesty," she said gently, "you asked for everything concerning the border disputes from 20 years ago." Adrian thanked her and began reading page after page beneath the warm glow of the fireplace. The deeper he searched, the more uncomfortable he became. Certain reports had been altered. Entire witness statements had disappeared. Official decisions carried signatures that belonged to men who had served under his late father rather than under the current crown. Benjamin Hayes quietly entered several hours later, and immediately recognized the troubled expression on Adrian's face. "Did you find something?" Adrian slowly closed the final ledger. "I found too many missing pieces." Benjamin remained silent as Adrian looked toward the falling snow outside the palace windows. "If Evelyn believes my family caused her pain, then I need to know whether that belief was born from rumor or truth." Across the valley, Evelyn stepped outside just before dusk carrying another armful of firewood. Fresh tracks crossed the untouched snow, leading to her porch exactly as they always did. This time, however, there were no flowers, no fruit, and no thoughtful gifts. Only a single smooth river stone rested on the top step. Someone had carefully painted one simple image upon it. A small white pine tree standing beneath a silver moon. Evelyn smiled softly as she picked it up. It was not a promise. It was not a request. It was simply a quiet reminder that patience could sometimes speak louder than words. As the evening sky darkened above the endless forest, two hearts carried the same unspoken question without either of them realizing it. What if the greatest obstacle between them was no longer destiny, but the unfinished truth waiting to be discovered? The investigation changed everything more quickly than Adrian Blackwood had expected. What began as a simple search through forgotten royal records soon became a journey into decisions made long before he had ever worn the crown. Day after day he met with retired council members, elderly village elders, and former palace servants whose memories had faded with time but whose honesty had not. Piece by piece, a clearer picture emerged. Years before Adrian became king, several influential nobles had abused the authority of the old throne to seize land throughout the northern territories. Families who refused unfair demands had quietly disappeared from official records, not through war, but through exile, intimidation, and carefully hidden decrees. One family name appeared again and again in the margins of faded documents: Carter. Adrian sat motionless for several minutes after reading the final report. No order bearing his father's personal seal had directly condemned Evelyn's family, yet men acting in the name of the crown had made choices that shattered countless innocent lives. The law had been followed. Justice had not. Benjamin Hayes watched the silence settle over the royal study before speaking softly. "What will you do?" Adrian slowly closed the last ledger. The only thing a king should do when he discovers the truth. The following morning, every member of the royal council received an unexpected summons. Advisors, governors, judges, and pack leaders gathered beneath the great dome of Moon Hall expecting discussions about winter trade. Instead, Adrian stood before them holding a stack of weathered documents tied together with blue ribbon. "For too many years," he began calmly, "our kingdom has celebrated order while ignoring fairness. That ends today." The hall remained perfectly silent as Adrian announced an independent review of every disputed land claim issued during his father's reign. Families who had lost homes through unlawful decisions would receive full hearings before an impartial council. Archived records would be open to the public. Hidden agreements would no longer remain hidden. Several older nobles exchanged nervous glances, but none interrupted their king. Adrian's voice never rose above a steady, measured tone. A crown is not honored by pretending mistakes never happened. A crown is honored by correcting them. News of the royal decree spread across the northern territories before sunset. Villages that had long accepted painful history as something unchangeable suddenly found themselves invited to speak openly for the first time in decades. Silver Pine Valley received the announcement 3 days later. Evelyn unfolded the official proclamation while standing beside the warm fireplace inside her cottage. She expected another ceremonial declaration filled with polished promises. Instead, every sentence sounded remarkably sincere. There was no attempt to excuse the past. No effort to defend previous rulers. Only a quiet commitment to uncover the complete truth, regardless of where it led. She read the final paragraph twice before setting the paper down. Outside, fresh snow drifted gently through the ancient pines. Moments later, a familiar gray wolf appeared beyond the garden fence, standing patiently beneath the bare branches of an old maple tree. This time he carried nothing. No flowers. No gifts. No thoughtful surprises. He simply sat in the snow, looking toward her with the same calm eyes that had never demanded forgiveness. Evelyn stepped onto the porch, the cold winter air filling her lungs. For several long moments neither of them moved. Finally she spoke so softly that only the forest could hear. "You knew he would do this, did not you?" The wolf lowered his head slightly, not with triumph, but with quiet humility. Evelyn looked toward the distant mountains where the royal palace stood hidden beneath silver clouds. For the first time since refusing the bond, she realized something that unsettled her far more than destiny ever had. Adrian Blackwood was no longer asking her to trust the Alpha King. He was patiently becoming a man worthy of trust, one choice at a time. Winter slowly surrendered to the first signs of spring, and with the changing season came an unexpected calm. The restless uncertainty that had followed Evelyn Carter for months no longer felt as heavy as it once had. The forest awakened with fresh birdsong. Tiny green shoots pushed through melting snow, and the river beyond her cottage flowed freely again. Yet one thing had quietly changed. The gray wolf no longer appeared every morning. Sometimes several days passed without a single paw print outside her home. There were no more baskets of fruit, no carefully stacked firewood, and no painted stones waiting on the porch. At first Evelyn convinced herself she preferred the silence. Then she realized she found herself listening for footsteps that never came. One afternoon she caught herself staring toward the tree line far longer than necessary before laughing softly at her own impatience. Somewhere inside her heart, absence had begun speaking louder than presence ever had. Far away inside the royal palace, Adrian Blackwood had made a decision that surprised everyone except Benjamin Hayes. "You are truly going to stop?" Benjamin asked while reviewing the king's travel schedule. Adrian nodded calmly. She asked for the freedom to choose. "And your wolf?" Adrian smiled faintly. He finally understands that hope is stronger when it is offered, not forced. The bond between king and wolf had become strangely peaceful. For the first time in months there was no constant pull toward Silver Pine Valley, no restless pacing beneath moonlit skies. His wolf remained quietly patient, as though believing the next step no longer belonged to him. Several weeks later the annual Spring Renewal Festival brought families from every neighboring village into the capital. Evelyn almost declined the invitation, but her closest friends insisted she deserved a day away from endless chores and quiet memories. The palace gardens overflowed with music, flowering cherry trees, and children laughing beneath colorful ribbons dancing in the warm breeze. Everywhere she looked, people smiled more freely than they had in years. The kingdom itself seemed lighter. She wandered through the celebration unnoticed, until she reached a peaceful corner overlooking a small reflecting pond. There, standing alone beneath a blooming dogwood tree, was Adrian. He wore no ceremonial cape, no jeweled crown, and no royal escort surrounded him. He looked less like the Alpha King and more like an ordinary man enjoying the first warm afternoon after a long winter. He noticed her almost immediately, yet he did not approach. Instead he offered a respectful nod and waited. Evelyn slowly crossed the stone path between them. Neither of them spoke for several quiet moments as flower petals drifted across the water. Finally Adrian broke the silence with a gentle smile. You look happy. Evelyn looked around the peaceful gardens before answering. Your kingdom looks happy. Adrian glanced toward families laughing beneath the blossoming trees. It belongs to all of us. She searched his face, expecting another careful apology or another patient request. None came. Instead, Adrian simply folded his hands behind his back. I wanted you to know something, he said softly. Whether your answer changes or remains exactly the same, I will never ask again. Evelyn blinked in surprise. Never. Adrian shook his head. Some choices deserve complete freedom. He smiled one final time before turning toward the palace gardens. Take care of yourself, Evelyn. He walked away without looking back. She watched him disappear among the flowering trees, and for the first time since they had met, she realized the silence he left behind felt far more frightening than every appeal that had come before. Several weeks passed after the spring renewal festival, and life settled into a peaceful rhythm neither Evelyn Carter nor Adrian Blackwood had expected. The kingdom flourished beneath clear blue skies. New families returned to lands that had finally been restored, and the stories people shared around evening fires were no longer filled with old resentments but cautious optimism. Evelyn watched those changes from her little cottage, quietly realizing that every promise the Alpha King had made had become reality without asking for anything in return. He never visited. No letters arrived bearing the royal seal. The gray wolf never appeared beneath her window again. The silence he had left behind remained complete, honoring the freedom he had promised her. At first she believed that was what she wanted. Then one warm evening she walked through her garden and noticed how instinctively her eyes searched the distant tree line. She smiled sadly at herself. The forest remained empty, but for the first time she understood that what she missed was never the gifts, the flowers, or the quiet surprises. She missed the steady kindness behind them. The following morning Evelyn opened her grandmother's final letter, the only one she had never gathered the courage to read. The faded paper carried just a few simple lines. True love is not measured by destiny, child. It is measured by the choices people continue making after destiny has spoken. Read those words carefully before you decide who deserves your tomorrow. Evelyn closed her eyes as tears of quiet understanding blurred the old handwriting. She had spent years believing that refusing the bond meant protecting her heart. She had never considered that someone could patiently earn her trust without asking her to surrender it. Before sunrise the next morning she packed a small travel bag, locked the cottage door, and began the long walk toward the capital. By the time she reached Moon Hall, the palace gardens were glowing beneath the golden light of early summer. Adrian stood alone near the reflecting pond where they had last spoken, studying a row of newly planted white roses. He turned at the sound of approaching footsteps, surprise briefly crossing his face before settling into the same calm smile she remembered. Lady Evelyn, he said gently, I hope your journey was pleasant. She stopped only a few feet away, her heart beat louder than the singing birds surrounding them. You kept your promise. Adrian nodded. I said I would never ask again. You did not. He smiled softly. Then I have nothing more to offer except my friendship, if you would ever want it. Evelyn looked into the silver eyes that no longer carried expectation, only quiet sincerity. She suddenly laughed through the emotion gathering in her voice. Your wolf was right. Adrian blinked in confusion. About what? She took one final step forward and reached for his hand, not because of a royal ceremony, not because of ancient tradition, and not because fate had demanded it years before. She chose him because he had chosen compassion over pride, truth over comfort, and patience over possession. He never stopped believing there would be another appeal, she whispered with a warm smile. Adrian gently closed his fingers around hers, still careful enough to leave room for her to pull away if she wished. She never did. Somewhere beyond the palace walls, a joyful howl rose from the distant forest before fading into the summer breeze. Adrian looked toward the mountains and laughed quietly. I suppose he finally won his case. Evelyn smiled as they walked together through the blooming gardens. No, she replied. He simply reminded us that the best decisions are never forced. They are freely made.